It is my pleasure to introduce to you our invited speaker. Mahzarin Banaji taught at Yale University from 1986 to 2002, where she was the Reuben Post-Halleck Professor of Psychology. Since then and at present, she is the Richard Clark Cabot Professor of Social Ethics in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, and simultaneously George A. and Helen Dunham Cowan Chair in Human Dynamics at the Santa Fe Institute. She also served as the first Carol Pforzheimer Professor at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. In 2005, Dr. Banaji was elected Fellow of the Society for Experimental Psychologists. In 2008, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2009, was named Herbert A. Simon Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. She is also a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Association for Psychological Science, for which she was the president. For her research, she has been awarded a James McKean Cattell Award, the Morton Deutsch Award for Social Justice, and fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the Santa Fe Institute. In 2000, her work with R. Bhaskar received the Gordon Allport Prize for Intergroup Relations, and her career contributions were recognized by a presidential citation from the American Psychological Association in 2007. She also received the Carol and Ed Diener Award for Outstanding Contributions to Social Psychology in 2009. Dr. Banaji studies unconscious thinking and feeling as they unfold in social contexts. She has primarily studied social attitudes and beliefs in adults and children, relying on multiple methods, including cognitive affective behavioral measures, neuroimaging. With these, she explores the implication of her work for questions of individual responsibility and social justice in democratic societies. Her current research focuses on the origins of social cognition and applications of implicit cognition to improve organizational practices. The title of her presentation is Blind Spot: Hidden Biases of Good People, which is a book she recently produced. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Mahzarin Banaji.
Okay, I'm gonna, while I put this microphone on, oh yeah, they always set it up for men, so you have to turn it around. Put it on so it will fit me. While I do this, I thought I would, for those of you who don't think culture matters, I noticed that as you were all chatting and Fred wanted your attention, he asked you to sit and you didn't listen. And I thought if I were him, I thought if I were him, I would just stand up here and say, hey, sit down. But instead, he pulled out this little delicate bell and he tinged it for you. So there you go. Big differences depending on where we come from as to what methods we use to deal with the world. Thank you for having me. Fred didn't mention that I went to graduate school at Ohio State University. I believe we have a shared enemy. And so I just thought, my enemy is my friend, and so I'm delighted to be here. All right. I am going to start with the most important slide first, and that is a few of the collaborators. I hope I'll mention their work today. The top row are people who've done basic research in social cognition with me on adults. The second row are collaborators who have done work with me on the development of social cognition in children from age 3 to about 10. And the third row are those who have done or taught me enough neuroscience that I have published with them, looking at sort of whether we can see if the kinds of tests that are our behavioral measures actually end up correlating with certain patterns, brain patterns that would give our behavioral measures some greater construct validity. So with that, let me just say that we'll begin with a few assumptions that we all share. I think as academic psychologists, we would say we are an inherently social species, and we are this from day one. Okay? This doesn't take long periods of protracted social interaction for us to develop to do this, and it continues. It continues through toddlerhood, where we continue to imitate, and here, beginning here and then certainly through adulthood, I'm going to focus on a couple of dimensions. The first is in deciding whom to follow and in deciding whom we should lead. I think we're going to see in our evidence, and certainly in the evidence of people, a much bigger group than just me, this idea that there are certain patterns that follow from a similarity to self. That similarity to self is a very major sort of path along which we match, and much of the world's resources and so on end up being spent differently because of these matches that happen spontaneously. And in civilized societies, we try to interfere with that. We think of that as something that's natural, but not necessarily something that is in the public good or even in the interest of individual people. The second thing that we do is to not look at the similarity to self, but we just look at groups out there and we ask the question of what are the attributes that we associate with them? What do we think about different kinds of groups when we ask people? What do you think about Jews? What do you think about Muslims? What do you think about tall people? Who has executive presence? These are all the kinds of questions that we might ask, as ordinary psychologists do on 7-point scales. We also use a different kind of a measure to get at this. And ultimately, I'm going to be interested in 2 different dimensions. One that we might call the good-bad dimension, or what Susan Fiske might call the warm-cold dimension. And certainly, we think of groups differently along that dimension. But there is an orthogonal dimension that we'll call something like the strength dimension, the potency dimension. Okay? People vary in how strong or competent we think that they are. And these 2 dimensions have given us very interesting pieces of evidence that don't necessarily fit with the way we used to think about the world. Okay? So I'm going to focus a little bit on that. But certainly, as we look at humans as a species, we do something with social groups that no other seems to do, and that is we find very fine distinctions amongst us and we carve out lines. This is just a small smattering of the groups that we might belong to. I can expand this list out infinitely. And it almost seems like when there is no difference, we will create one, because it will make sense to our minds to do that. I was visiting my friend Sharon in Champaign, at University of Illinois. She lives in Champaign. Everybody knows Champaign? Everybody knows that next door to it is a very similar town called Urbana. And as I'm walking down with her down the street on the night before garbage is collected, she said to me, you know, the people in Urbana, they don't line their garbage up properly. And this to me is a wonderful example of how even when you're part of an incredibly homogeneous community, you will see these kinds of differences, and we've been studying them because of these 2 simple assumptions that social groups shape us, and then through us, they shape the world. So every day when I walk to school, I walk under a gate, and that gate says something very nice that you might expect to see at an institution of higher learning. It says, as you enter it, enter to grow in wisdom. As you depart from this gate, as I do every day, it says, depart to serve better thy country and thy kind. If you've become wise, now you should also do some good. But I've often wondered as I walk through this gate, what did the people who inscribed these words really mean by their kind? Okay? What did they have in mind when they said, serve your kind? And so I've thought about the people who inscribed these, and these are 5 Harvard presidents in the 1800s, and I wondered, in their mind, who was their kind? Who was thy kind that they thought we should be serving? And then I realized that a little research will teach me very quickly who they meant was their kind. This was their kind. This is a very lush and beautiful private school in a town called Groton, not far from Cambridge. In the first 4 decades of the 20th century, 405 boys applied from Groton School to Harvard. Okay? 402 of those boys were admitted. Okay? You sort of wonder how bad those 3 people were who did not get in. Like, what was really wrong with them? Hopefully they went off to war and did some noble thing like that rather than were rejected. So they knew what their kind was, and I don't have to tell you. I can give you thousands of pieces of evidence. I'm going to tell you that who is allowed in is an act of helping. It's a very good thing. But we, in our modern minds, have to begin to ask that kind of question of who is being allowed in, because certainly there is lots of evidence also that it's not just who we included, but the other side of it, of course, is exclusion. And exclusion can be done in some very ordinary way by simply helping a particular kind, or it can be pretty active. Okay? And in the past, I'm going to argue, we explicitly excluded. Okay? Very, very simple. The other place I taught at was Yale, and Yale has had a very strong history of anti-Semitism. So in the, up until the 1950s, I would say even a little beyond that, you knew that if you were Jewish, that you simply should not apply to Yale. You should not apply if your address was the Bronx or Brooklyn or something like that. But if you should dare to apply, then something like this might happen. In the late 1940s, Dan Oren prints this in his book, this book called Joining the Club, A History of Jews at Yale, in which he's reprinted a picture from a 1940s application form. And in a box that says, reason for rejecting the candidate, some dean or some professor has scrawled in it, he has a Mediterranean nose. Okay? That was sufficient in the 1940s to indicate to your kith and kin around you that why you were not admitting somebody, and everybody understood what that meant, and it was not questioned. I put this before you because today we're embarrassed by it. You know, I can see the look of horror that appeared on each of your faces momentarily as you quickly tried to control it. And I can tell you that we should not think that we haven't changed. Of course we've changed. We've changed in a gazillion different ways. I can tell you that today these campuses are quite different. Okay? I'll give you only one. Certainly, I just looked that up this morning. In fact, I looked to see how well are we really doing. And I noticed that certainly gender, ethnicity, and race, which I'm surprised by, actually tracks the country. It's not lower than what it is in the country as a whole. Geographic diversity is actually better than most because unlike your school, which is a regional school, we have to bring people from every state in the country, required to have geographic diversity and certainly international presence and so on. So on that, we're okay. But what I was really happy to see, because we've been talking about it for a long time, is that 20% of the class at Harvard, the entering class, is going to come from people who make $65,000 a year or less. Okay, 20% of the class. That wouldn't have been true even when you went. Somebody in the, you. And they pay zero. And then if you come from a family where your family makes 65 to 150, you pay something between 0 and 100. Now this is a vast change, and this group makes up another 50%. Okay? So this is a different place. But how is it different? Why is it different? It's different because our minds change over time, and it changes our behavior. Or our behaviors change, and we say, you know, this must also in some way change our minds, and social psychologists have shown both of those paths, especially this one, which is the more counterintuitive one. Okay? So what is our role, given that I've shown you the arc, all the way from he has a Mediterranean nose to what we see today? And I'm going to argue that our job is to present the evidence. All we can do is take things like similarity to self, or how do we think of somebody as worthy? How do we think of somebody as competent? And our job is not to make policy. It is not to say necessarily even what people should do. Our job is, as scientists, I mean, as a citizen, I can say everything else, but as a scientist, my job is to just show. And I'm reminded of this article that I'd read many, many years ago when Martin Luther King Jr. gave a talk at a meeting of the APA convention. It was just a few months before he was assassinated. When he was asked, like, what should we as scientists do? His answer was very simple. He said, tell it like it is. And I think that that is what we do every single day. We try very hard to tell it like it is, whether it agrees with our hypotheses or not. And the students and I had a wonderful conversation today about how to improve the integrity of our science. And I hope that they will all sign up at the Center for Open Science and register data sets and so on, even if their advisors are sluggish. Okay, on that. Okay. All right. So one of the studies that Jason Mitchell and I did some years ago is a study in which we brought people from our town into the lab, and we introduced them to two individuals, one a Republican, the other a Democrat. Before I tell you that, I should tell you, we're jokingly called the People's Republic of Cambridge, so people are distinctly more likely to be liberal. But as you'll see, the data don't change as a function of whether you're liberal or conservative. What they show is that both groups do something very similar. They learn about these two people, one who happens to be liberal, the other is conservative. One lives on the East Coast, the other lives in the southern part of the United States. The first one could not believe that George Bush won the second time. The second one worked on the Bush campaign. But other than those differences, they're both actually equally good at everything. They're equally good people, students, whatever you want to think about. All right. After they learn about them, they're in a scanner, and all we're doing while we're scanning is to ask very simple questions that have nothing to do with politics. What is the likelihood that John cleans his room every week or every month or every year? Questions that are meaningful to undergraduate students, things like that. And what we discovered is that when they answer those questions, they engage a region in medial PFC when they're answering it for people who match their politics. So when you think about the similar others, so if John is similar to you and Matthew is different from you because you are, let's say, liberal, then these are the neurons that will be active when you think about John, the similar other, and the ones in the more dorsal part of medial PFC are active when you think about Matthew, the different other. Conservative, so this is, please remember, these are not the Democrat neurons and the Republican neurons. This is about self. This is about similarity to self. And I'll call these the Dartmouth neurons because so many papers that came out of Dartmouth actually identified these neurons when I was quite skeptical about their role, and showing that these neurons are often come online whenever we think about ourselves. When the comparison is me and somebody else, these neurons seem to become active. Very little is known about their projections, but I wouldn't be surprised if future research shows that these do have a faster bus to the other parts of our brains that bring online feelings that we may eventually label as empathy or sympathy or whatever else it might be. Okay? So that kind of study tells us a little bit about similarity to self having some basis. But I'm here to tell you that I think, and there are several of you who are such experts in industrial organizational psychology, that I have little to add on this, knowing that when you look at the world of how we hire people, how we promote people, who we think should belong in our society, that we do that often based on this kind of similarity to self. And there are large numbers of studies, and I'm going to show you in our data some evidence that depending on where you sit in a group matters. Okay? That we're not oblivious to that. So I'm going to just put forward a new thesis based on some of the things that we've said, for which there is really very poor evidence so far. And the thesis is that we no longer discriminate by going off on a horse and harming people who are different from us. I'm unlikely to go across town to burn down the church of somebody from a different denomination, because most likely I don't even have a denomination. Now, I don't think that's happening anymore. So how is it that we continue to keep these lines going and differences? I think discrimination in the modern world happens because of who we help. And this might be worthy of study. That's the manner in which helping, which is a very positive thing to do. We actually know it to be a pro-social thing. We want lots of people to help lots of other people. There are all kinds of incentives that we try to create in children to learn to help. And I'm going to say that again, when we now think differently from those 5 Harvard precedents about who is our kin, I think how we help itself is going to have to be rethought. And who we help. But that's just a thesis, and some students in my lab are beginning to look for evidence on how much it is that subtle kinds of help go to the in-group rather than explicit acts of harm to an out-group. If we switch away from talking about self and similarity to self, the next question that we're faced with is, okay, put that dimension aside. Now just let's look at when we see people, when we ask them, how do you make your decisions, what do they tell us? Here's a story. This is a story of Encyclopedia Britannica, which everybody in this room has heard of, right? Everybody knows the name Encyclopedia Britannica. Okay? But when you were in doubt last, did you really look it up? When is the last time you opened an Encyclopedia Britannica, I may ask? For those of you who are under 40, I would say never, probably. Right? But something interesting happened to Encyclopedia Britannica in 1981 or so. This group of people showed up at their doorstep and they said to Encyclopedia Britannica's CEO, we have a new business model for you. If you put the encyclopedia in this new thing called software, you will be able to sell the encyclopedia for a whole lot less money and still make 4 times what you're currently making. Okay? And the apocryphal story, at least, is the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica said to these young men, thank you very much. We've been around for 225 years. We think we have this business model pretty nailed. Thank you. Okay? And off they went. Several of you smile knowingly because this is such an iconic image now. This is Microsoft Corporation in 1978. Young Bill Gates here in the bottom left-hand corner. Okay. I want you to put yourself in the mind of the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica circa 1981. And I want you to ask yourselves a very simple question. Would you invest in these people? Would you give $1 to a man with sideburns like that? I don't think so. I really think that almost all of us would have done what that CEO did. Things are working just fine. We have a fantastic business model. How could we be around for 225 years if we weren't doing things right? And off these folks would have gone to change our lives and create a revolution, right? So I'm here to tell you that it's not that we don't learn. We're learning beings. I learned certainly from this. I remember this story when a kid who looks very much like this guy walked into my office, except that Leon is black, and he said to me, "Professor, I'm a dropout from Yale and I've moved to Cambridge and I have a new startup and will you sit on my science board?" And I said, "Well, Leon, who else is on your science board?" And he said, "Nobody, it'll just be you." And so I am Leon's science board because I looked at him and I said, "People who look like this are going to make a lot of money. I should support this kid." Right? So I'm not completely dumb. I can learn from the mistakes of the CEO of Encyclopedia Britannica. But, and the big but, and you know that but, I believe that I screw up every single day. I think that all sorts of interesting people come by my office and make all kinds of interesting suggestions about the future of the next study, or how we might make a conference on this or that. And my worry is that because they do not fit the template of what genius means in my old mind, that those words that they say may go past me in some deep way, that really literally my sense organs aren't receptive to certain aspects. For one thing, they talk differently. They all, young people do this thing called uptalk, like they're always talking like they're not certain of what they know. Like they'll say sentences like, "The earth is round," as if they don't know it's round, and put a period at the end of that sentence. So that kind of talk, it is quite possible, makes me not think that the person is smart. And I'm here to tell you that this is probably happening a lot, not just on voice and on things like that, but on a variety of dimensions. And the problem is that these young people should not change a whit, right? The problem is mine. I have to be able to take that, set it aside, and go right at this thing that I call talent, that I believe after 33 years or whatever, I should be able to detect it. But my record is abysmal, okay? My record is absolutely terrible. I mean, I'm pretty much fluctuating around chance at being able to predict who's going to be good or who's not going to be good. And that's not okay any longer. As we get evidence from people like you in this room, there needs to be a gathering of it so that our decision making about the worth of people, their talents, their abilities, whatever, improves in some way. And there's not one, there's not 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 studies that show that social group membership predicts a variety of things about the outcome. And these are audit studies where we know that things have been held equal, and whether it's a bank loan or housing or access to medicine, how quickly you're treated in an emergency room, whatever it might be, we know that these things matter. It matters so much. Do you guys know this study where if you were born in this country a long time ago in a town where the town council decided to put fluoride in the water, compared to people who came from non-fluoride towns, equating everything like education level and health and so on, the fluoride people end up making 3% more in salary that can be attributed to fluoride in the water. Okay? This is insane. This should not be happening. It's not like I look at my friend Susan and say, "Oh, Susan has such nice teeth, let's give her more money this year." That's not the way it's happening, but something is happening. Something leads me to think that she should be the one presenting to the X group or the Y group. And she does a terrific job, and then off she goes and gets her reward. So I think for us, it should be pretty clear that these things happen. And all we've done in our research is to take all of these qualities and many more, and then just dumbly pair them up with traits like good and bad, strong and weak, violent or pacifist, whatever, and see how our minds think in that mode, but not by asking people so much, "What do you think?" Okay, then that's the. So for those of you, there are people in this room who are IAT jocks. So I don't want to actually go through like a whole description of what this method is. It's called the implicit association test. It was invented and developed in the mid-1990s. We've had data from it for about 20 years, and there are thousands of studies now that use it in a variety of contexts. But I want to just give you an example. In this test, you'd see in the middle of the screen any one of these words. Some of these words, as you can see, belong to the group Michigan State, any of these words, or they could come from your rival school of University of Michigan. But along with those words, you would have to do something using 2 computer keys. For half the trials, you would have to associate any word you see from Michigan State with words that mean good things, like love, peace, joy, friend, sunshine, glory, success, all these good things. While you are also associating Michigan with bad things, words like devil, bomb, war, vomit, awful, failure, things like that. Okay? These trials on a computer would be a piece of cake for you. You would whip through this. It wouldn't even feel harder than just categorizing good and bad. You'd be so fast. Your average response time would be, if I did the test for you now, it would be about 650 milliseconds in this room. If I make you switch and I ask you to use the same computer key to respond to a bad word like devil and Michigan State, and do the opposite, good things with Michigan, you would slow down dramatically. Your reaction time would drop to over 900 milliseconds, and that's such a whopping statistically significant difference that, as my friends say, you don't need a computer to measure this, a sundial will do. And that is true. We could use a sundial and still get the result. Okay, so our attempt in doing this work was not to go around studying social groups. That was not the original intent. The intent was to develop a measure that just produced bigger effects than other measures that were present before we decided to put our heads to this. So in the work we will do, there are three, using this test, using the IAT, we began to do some very simple things, thinking that our measure comes not from any recent idea in psychology. This measure, associate two things on one side and two on the other, test how fast you do that, then switch it, now test again, take the difference in reaction time. To us, that was an idea that was so old that it should have been completely non-controversial, right? What were the three ideas that are completely non-controversial on which the IAT rests? First of all, we will make a simple statement. We think we're tapping into some form of associative learning. Okay? I don't think that Pavlov or Donald Hebb are still controversial, right? So all we're saying is if things have been firing together, they will wire together. Something as dumb or simple as that. We're not making any special claims about the nature of associative learning or anything. We're just saying it seems like if associations have been made in the world for us and we've learned them, that this test might be able to pick some of them up. Okay. The second non-controversial claim that we made is that, yes, while we are a very fancy-dancy species that can paint and speak in many languages and do all sorts of hunky-dory things, what we also know about ourselves is that we have capacities that are best referred to as bounded in nature. We are not fully rational creatures. We are boundedly rational. And people like Herb Simon taught us about that, both in the nature of the individual mind, but also in the nature of corporations and organizations. And more recently, this idea is completely widespread through the culture, if not the world, through the great work of Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman. So this notion that human beings have bounds on their rationality is something that Herb put nicely into words. He said, humans have neither the facts nor the consistent structure of values, nor the reasoning power that they need at their disposal to make decisions in line with what our colleagues in economics would say we do, which is to make decisions in line with subjective expected utility. Instead, Herb said, this notion of pure rationality is a beautiful object deserving a prominent place in Plato's heaven of ideas, but impossible to employ in any literal way in making actual human decisions. I think most psychologists, although I did hear a debate just a couple of days ago between Josh Tannenbaum on the one hand, who's a Bayesian and believes the world we see is perfectly represented in our heads, and Gary Marcus, who argued the other side. I still think that most people would agree that the world out there is complex and we have a rough approximation of it in some way, leading to many kinds of errors that we might make, some pretty striking errors. And the third and also completely uncontroversial assumption we make, and the one that's most important to me, comes from a hero of mine, Hermann von Helmholtz, from whom we know, and as experimental psychologists, this would be the far more important source for us than, let's say, Freud, who also said a lot about the unconscious. He just said, look, the eye is too simple to be able to take all this complexity and represent it. We do stuff with the stuff that comes in, and that's called an unconscious inference. And I think what our work is going to tap into are those kinds of unconscious inferences that are extremely ordinary. And all we do is take those three assumptions that almost everybody in this room would agree with in one form or another, and we apply them to the study of how we take a grouping like this, let's say race, black and white, or Asian and white, something like that, and then some property. Are they American? Are they foreign? What if I tell you that they're all American? Will you now see them to all be American? And we tested that, and it became incredibly contentious all of a sudden. So three very simple principles, but when put together in the context of social groups, ended up activating not just neo-Nazi groups, but also the ire of many colleagues. Okay, so what kinds of things have we been up to for the last 20 years? I can't tell you about all of it, although in your Q&A I'm happy to go wherever you'd like to go. These are the kinds of questions my graduate students are interested in following up on. Just understanding what the nature of the effect is. How big is it? What makes it be, bigger or smaller under certain conditions? The signature of the work. If there's one fact that we will put out there as what is probably best known about it, it is that what we discover on the measure of implicit cognition does not always seem to match what people say when they're asked the question explicitly. So the separation of the two becomes of interest. You should also know that there is a misunderstanding that they're always dissociated. They're not. There are conditions under which what we say on a piece of paper on a scale of 1 to 5 and what we show on this test are nicely matched. In the last 10 years, I would say I truly have reinvented myself as a developmentalist. I spend most of my time working with children at about age 3 because we're interested in how early some of these are learned. I was raised as a social psychologist. I believed very much that whether you're 3 years old or an adult should matter on certain things, that your experience levels are quite different when it comes to dealing with the social world. And so I was quite blown away when some of our data showed incredible consistency in the data from 3 onwards through adulthood, forcing me to change my assumptions about some things that I had believed about social learning. How universal, very universal everywhere in the world you see them, but completely cultural, not identical in each place at all. We've looked at both physiological and neural signatures of these effects, and I can tell you more. I just, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to drop some stuff. Very interested in the question of prediction of all sorts of things, from behavior in the real world to all kinds of convergent validation kinds of things that we should see if indeed what we're seeing is tapping into something that we think is an affective response, if it is the good-bad test. And finally, and this is what many, many people are working on, is the question of how malleable, how stable are these associations? Do they move around? And we know that they're fairly elastic now. That they're not stable in that sense. They're elastic, and they change in lawful ways, as you would predict, based on certain training or experiences that you've had, but they snap right back to where they were unless there is immersive long-term change. And so for anybody who's a clinician, this becomes very interesting as a measure, and in fact, I would say that that's the field in which this test has done its best work, that many clinical psychologists have used it as an indirect way to look at whether a certain kind of treatment program is actually having the kind of impact that they're using. And I became very interested in this one clinical question, and that was suicide. About 6 years ago, somebody from the military came to us to say that they were seeing evidence that American soldiers in Iraq were more likely to take their own lives than were dying in combat. And when those data were not known publicly, and it was the first time I'd ever heard those data, it shook me up enough that Matt Knock, a colleague in the clinical area, and I did a bunch of studies in which we used the IAT to try to predict who's likely to make a second suicide attempt by just being in a hospital and measuring anybody who came in having attempted suicide and then waiting to see what happened, which is not a nice study to do. And discovered at the end of this study that a simple, dumb IAT, me, not me, life, death. That association is a better predictor of who's likely to make a second attempt than self-report, clinician report, or any existing depression or other inventory. So it's now being used by the US military to identify people at risk. And just today I saw in the New York Times a story that suicide rates are falling in the military. So hopefully that will continue. All right, how do we do this work? Well, we decided in 1998, it may be hard for you to imagine what the state of the web was in 1998, but certainly there was not any research happening on the web, and we decided, and we basically buried ourselves in a laboratory for a month, and we built a website. And that website went through enough testing that we were pretty certain that the data we were able to collect there would be pretty similar to what we were collecting in our lab. And this is basically the advantage of the method, that in spite of different refresh rates on different screens and different browsers and so on, that the results are either sort of there or not there, enough that if they're there, you're going to pick it up even if you're working on a van. So this will tell you about the naivete of scientists. I thought, I was at Yale at the time, and for us, one of the biggest problems was getting subjects. I always envy all of you who teach at schools with larger numbers of kids, because, you know, what I might take a year to do, you can knock off in a month, right? Because you have larger numbers of kids who can come in and take your tests. And so I thought, okay, how do I beat the people at Michigan State? I'm going to put this on a web, and maybe in a year we'll get 500 people. That would be fantastic. What we had no clue about was that at the end of the first month, we would have 45,000 completed tests. And not because we advertised. There's something about this experience that I think, besides the number, I think you have to reflect on why. Like, why is this happening? Why are people voluntarily going online and taking not 1 but 10? Why are they writing us angry notes, nice notes, crying notes, laughing notes? Why this? And I think it is a very simple, in some ways, answer, but a very optimistic one. A, people want to know what's in their heads, especially if it's something they think they can't see. B, they're troubled by their data, which is when they're angry at us. When their data come back saying, you know, you cannot make the association between dark skin and good as fast as you're making it between light skin and good. They're mad, and they write to us about it. And I don't blame them. In fact, I write them back saying, thank you, because this was my experience. And so one of the things I've been doing, when Fred said I teach governmental agencies and for-profit corporations a lot of this kind of stuff, it's because they're, I think, very ready for this message. They need to know that people, ordinary people like myself, not only carry these, but that you shouldn't assume that just because I'm female or a person of color that I may not have them in my mind. And that, I think, is something that the data from the web were very effective, because until then, nobody would have believed. Even if we had had large numbers of college students, I really don't think that the data would have had the kind of impact that they have. Sorry about the color, but this is the website. I'm sure if you have had a teenager or older kid in the last few years, they've all been subjected to this test by their teachers. So it's now, I think, 16 million, I think, is about what we crossed, 16 million tests taken. And we slowly began to develop different country versions. So most of the data come from English-speaking countries, but there are substantial data now from many countries that have websites doing the same thing, but in their own languages. What I thought I would do, because there's so many people who have never seen these data and others of you who know them inside out, is to just tell you that the easiest way to look at the data is in the form of a histogram. Okay? This is just the number of people, number of participants. And I'm just going to, so the score on the IAT, if it's a 0, it means you were no different in associating one group with good and the other with good, okay? And that's all. So you're looking, if the population as a whole showed no difference, if they had no bias, you would see everybody clustered around this 0 point right here, okay? The more of the dark bars, the larger that is, the more you're seeing more people are showing a white preference here than people who are showing a black preference here. That's all this. Does that make sense? And the open bars are people that we would regard to be relatively neutral. So we'd say they're not really significantly one way or the other, okay? And so something like 70% overall. I can just run through these so you can just see. Same thing for dark skin, light skin. Stronger association of good with light skin rather than with dark skin, many fewer. Able versus disabled should not, many people will say it wouldn't surprise them, but this is an interesting effect because certainly on self-report measures, people report very low disliking of people with a disability, and this is among the largest associations. Young and elderly, very, very interesting test. I think it's among our biggest effects, something like 85% show an association of young with good, okay? Rather than elderly, and I'll come back if I have time to show you the data from the elderly themselves. This one is an interesting result because, yes, there is a preference for thin over fat, but no difference between what you say here and what you show here and what you say. You say these days. So people in this room, because you belong to a minority who believe that it's not okay to say that, or truly believe that it's not okay, that we must be such a minority that our data don't affect anything, because in the population, the effect is just as large on verbal self-report as it is on the implicit measure. This effect is on associating female with things like children, garden, kitchen, etc., male with briefcase, computer, office, profession, things like that. And this is another interesting result from a gender perspective. Same thing, even women in science will show an association of male with science more so than female with science. We use weapons that are not traditional weapons. We use weapons that are very old weapons, like sabers and cannons and things like that, and we still see strong association of black with weapons rather than with harmless objects and relatively speaking to white. And because you are a bunch of nerds in here, I thought I would just at least show you that you want to just pay attention on these tests and don't even look below the break here, just look above, and this will tell you this is Cohen's d. So a Cohen's d of about 0.8 is considered a large effect. And what you'll see are several of these kinds of effects that are approximating very, very large effects, and much smaller on the self-report or explicit measure. Okay, so those two, comparing the larger numbers here to the larger numbers here is a reasonably good indication of what this says. There's one odd test here that I can explain later why it's that way, and that's the Arab Muslim test, but that's because it's not the right IAT. So I'll tell you about that later. Okay, so that's on liking. On associating good and bad. These are the most fundamental properties. When you look at somebody, the first thing you think about is, do I trust this person? Alex Todorov's work and others show us that we do that based even on simple facial structures. But I'm more interested these days in looking at particular properties that we assign to different groups of people spontaneously. And I can tell you that the very first study ever of stereotypes was done in the early 1930s, where two psychologists from the University of Michigan went to Princeton, and they did, at the time maybe Dan Katz was at Princeton, but in any case, eventually he was at Michigan. And they asked people, tell us, what do you think about all of these different ethnic groups? And these are data from 1933. And people in those days in Princeton, New Jersey, were happy to say, oh, Italians, oh, I can tell you. I think they are imaginative, religious, dirty, lazy, unreliable. This just popped out of their mouths when you asked them, right? This, we can tell you, has changed dramatically. If you go to any textbook on attitudes, intergroup attitudes, you will see that every 15 years, some other group of psychologists went back to the same locations and asked very similar kinds of questions, and the data are completely different. You don't get anything like this anymore. And you stopped getting it from the 70s, and certainly now, many of these, some of the positive ones you'll still see, but not most of the negative ones, absolutely no evidence. So I was at Princeton and I actually did this. A few years ago I said to them, tell me, what do you think about these different social groups? And I used different names and so on. And they looked at me horrified. They looked at me like a police officer was going to come and take me away for just asking the question. That's how much we have changed, okay? One group of students, amazing people, come up to me after this experience is over and they said, Professor, we were so upset that you would do such a thing, to ask us this, that we screwed up your study explicitly by taking the items that belong to one group and shoving them into the other just to screw up your study. Now, I said to them, power to you. Your parents should be incredibly proud of you. But answer me this. How did you know what to move from one place to the other? That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the fact that even though up and down the East Coast we say there's no longer any anti-Semitism, then how come after the Bernie Madoff event I began to hear all sorts of anti-Semitic things even on liberal radio stations? How come? And I think it's because people knew in Shakespearean England what the stereotypes of Jews are, and they have not gone away entirely. They're still there, but they're pretty well clamped until one man does something, and then the lid is lifted. Okay? And now it becomes possible to entertain it just momentarily at least. Again, the same kind of thing. So I'm very interested in the fact that I don't think stereotypes are put in nice Ziploc bags and into freezers. I think that they're alive and active and sitting right under the surface, waiting for an event to occur. in a corporation, one woman leaves to have children, fear spreads that all the women are leaving to have babies. That's what I mean. And that's why I am here to tell you that once we are smart, we will figure that out and we will not make base rate errors of the kind that we currently do because we're being dumb. So, why did I go to this event? This event was very important to me personally because Wen-Ho Lee, many of you may remember this story, but Wen-Ho Lee was a nuclear scientist at the Los Alamos labs, and I read the story in the New York Times for the first time in which he had been accused of selling American nuclear secrets to the Chinese government. Okay? And being who I am, I was immediately somewhat suspicious, and I said, well, who knows what he really did. But 3 months later, I was completely persuaded that Wen-Ho Lee was a criminal. Why? Because there were 59 indictments against Wen-Ho Lee, and he was packed away and in jail. Okay? Which is why, when the story unraveled, and it became clear that Wen-Ho Lee had done nothing of this kind, I felt I had to go to lab and talk about this and tell people I had believed this. To me, this seemed completely plausible. And so then I read lots about it, and it made me just ask a simple question. What if his name were Robert E. Lee? Would I have thought the same? Would the FBI have thought the same? Would the judge who put him away and then apologized have thought the same, and so on? And so to save face, they eventually cleared him of 58 of the 59 indictments. The last indictment that they allowed to stand was that he had downloaded files from a computer that you shouldn't download files from. All right, so Thierry Devos was a postdoc of mine. He had come from Switzerland, and we said, so what does it mean to be American? This guy is American. He's a naturalized citizen. Everybody knows technically he's American. But there's something, and then we said, isn't it interesting if you look at all the people in the past that we think of as having committed treason? Names are like the Rosenbergs and Sacco and Vanzetti, and the list can go on and on. Wouldn't it be interesting? So what did we do? We went back and we looked. Oh yeah, in the Katzenbraley list from 1933, nobody would say this anymore, but there they are. And so Thierry Devos did an IAT in which he taught people first that these were college students, all born and raised in this country, their family histories are described. In this case, they know that they all came to the US at about the same time in terms of great-grandparents or grandparents or whatever it was. And then in the IAT, he had them associate European faces with American symbols and Asian faces with foreign symbols using 2 keys, and looked at how fast they did that. And then he had them switch. And the data showed, as you might now expect, but not if you didn't know. Oops, sorry, let me just back up here. Does it not say? Oh, something's missing here. Okay, in any case, I'm just going to show you the reaction time data here, but white and American is a lot faster for us to do than Asian and American. This effect is humongous, okay? Now, when you ask people this, when you take this test, it's a little weird because you know the right answer. You know that your fingers should not be moving any faster for one pair versus the other, but it's happening. And so when you tell people, why do you think it happened, they come up with reasonable answers. They'll say, Asians, after all, came to this country later than European Americans did. And we always think about immigrants as having certain waves, and the ones who came earlier are obviously the ones who are more of whatever that is, and that's a very reasonable idea. So we said, what do we think would happen if we had Native Americans and European Americans? There we know which came first, we think. So let's look at that, and we did that, and that result comes out pretty much like the one with Asian Americans. In fact, it's a little bit bigger, where Native Americans are less American. And then we said we have to be critical of our own work, and we said, but that seems reasonable, right? These are not symbols of Native Americans. They didn't make these things. These are the symbols associated with European Americans, and so of course there would be a relation. So we did a study in which we replaced all of this with natural scenes from the United States, famous scenes of waterfalls and mountains and things that we would, if anything, inherently associate more with Native Americans or Native peoples. And again, the test result comes out looking just the same. White Americans are more American than Native Americans, okay? And the result holds for Black Americans as well, except in Black Americans themselves, who see themselves as equally American as white Americans. All right, so this we'll call the crazy study, because now what we can do is tell people these are Americans. Everybody knows. They know their faces. At least when we did it, they knew their faces. They might still. They certainly knew all their names, and I'll tell you, these people, you know, are not American. Okay? Leave this out for a moment. Okay? So this is a test in which you are shown names and or faces of people who are known to be Asian and American, for sure, versus those who you know are white and are not American. Okay? And now you take the IAT. Which one do you think is more American? Americans or Europeans? And same pattern of data. To us, Hugh Grant is more American than Connie Chung or somebody like that. Right? So these studies are what we'll call kind of this is a study that is dumb because people who take this test just laugh at their own behavior because they can't believe that their fingers aren't moving the way that they ought to be. And this is the American Asian kind of effect, and that's the native one that I told you about earlier. And this is, to me, the single most interesting test because this is a reversal. On the IAT, white is American, Native American is not. When you ask them the question on explicit, it's the other way around, as the facts might indicate. Okay, how much time do I have, Fred? I got very little done, but anyway.
4:30.
Okay.
Until 5, so
take a few more minutes to show you a little bit more data, and then hopefully you'll still stay. Okay. So one result that we were getting early on that was sort of a moving, almost sort of a sad result, was to look at the behavior of people who came from disadvantaged groups on our test. Okay? Because if there's something as simple as every member of every group likes its own better than the other, that's one way in which the world would make sense. Okay? White people show preference for white over black on this test. Black people show a preference for black over white on this test. And likewise, young and elderly, whatever it might be. Okay? But my student, John Jost, and I had been talking about reviving an old idea that is part of Marxian theory, the notion of false consciousness, the notion that even people who belong to the very groups that are discriminated against end up in some way justifying or explaining away why the world is the way it is. And many years after John and I had talked about it, and many years after he had done lots of very interesting experiments to show that system justification, I mean, think about system justification. It's a very odd idea. On the one hand, evolutionary theory, psychoanalytic theory would tell us that we do things to protect the ego. Okay? We do things to save ourselves. It's a normal survival principle, and we are not surprised when we see evidence for it. Okay? But along came some social psychologists who said, these are the social identity people, and they said, it's not always the ego that's being protected or the self. We really care so much about our groups that evolutionary theory and social identity people said, you'll save members of your group sometimes even over yourself. And here comes this upstart of a student saying, let's go one step beyond that. Let's say you won't even save yourself or your own group, that you will do things in the interest of protecting the larger system. That seems undefensible in some way. Why would we do it? But maybe there is a motive like that. And so when many years later when we did the IAT, long after sort of John had left, what we noticed are these patterns that I would say can only be explained as system justification in some way. Here are data. These are people who are 8 years old all the way to people who are relatively more elderly, 70. And the green line is what they say explicitly. You ask them, how much do you like people who are elderly or young? Okay? As you become more elderly with every decade, you report more and more liking for the elderly. Okay? So that's result number one. An in-group preference, if you might want to call it that. And one. What's remarkable is the data on the IAT. No shift as a function of your own age as to whether you show a preference for young versus elderly. And this particular group, I think, is actually quite unusual. There's almost no other group where you see something as bad. Usually you'll just see a slower slope, but here it's flat. And I think that that's notable. And I'm going to tell you that I think we shouldn't simplistically conclude that it's bad or good. I'm going to argue that those elderly people who do not associate elderly with good are, in a sense, distancing themselves from the category elderly. I wouldn't be surprised if those who do that end up thinking of themselves as younger and continuing to do things in the real world as if they were more young. Okay? On the other hand, I can also see that if you do that, there will be some negative consequences. I think you may not save enough for retirement, for example, if you can. So there are, so what we do with these data and whether we think they end up being in the interest of people or not is a different matter than what the data are actually telling us, which is, of course, our job. On the race test overall, amongst white Americans, about 75%, I've just broken it down into two without the neutrals, spreading them appropriately. And what you see is about 75% are pro-white. But what you'll see here, and this is a result that's been replicated no matter where we study this, about half of African Americans, but also Africans in South Africa, show association of good with their group, but the other half do not. Okay? And in South Africa, it's even a little bit worse with post-apartheid kids showing more white preference. Okay. Christina Olsen, a student of mine who did some early work on system justification in young children, did a bunch of studies in which she would tell children that there were two groups. The blue t-shirt people always got 2 cookies, and the red t-shirt people always had 1 cookie. And they learned that. And then she gave them 3 cookies. And she said, how do you want to give them to these groups? And 3 years and a few years beyond that will do exactly what they've seen. Did I say blue got more? Yes. If blue got more, then they will give 2 to the blues that already got more and 1 to the red that already got red. Okay? By the time they reach age 8, they begin to think about this a little bit differently. They'll say, I don't know. They're basically saying, I don't care what the world has done to make this unfairness happen, and they have now the cognitive wherewithal to start to break a cookie in half, and they'll say, I'll try to give 1.5, 1.5, or 1 and 1 and throw the other one away. Okay? That's what 8 years will do. And only by the time you're 12 do you say, the blues got more, I'm going to give them less, and the reds already got more, less, so I'm going to give them more. So, the conclusion, sort of simplistically, if you want to remember the result, is 3-year-olds are like Republicans, 8-year-olds are like independents. You have to be about 12 years old before you'll begin to be able to think more progressively. Yeah? I'm going to skip through some of the weapons stuff to tell you that I think, all right, so the study that I mentioned to you, which startled me, is this. When you ask adults, which group do you like more, black or white, they're somewhere around 50% in choosing one over the other, meaning at chance, meaning they're choosing roughly equally. Okay? One turn you'll pick one group, the other turn you'll pick the other group, and that's often what you see in white adults. Not a result to scoff at. It took us many centuries to get there, so we should be pleased when we see something like that. Okay? What do 10-year-olds do? 10-year-olds are a little bit more honest. They will just pick the one that is from their own group, and they'll not want to play or share toys or whatever it is with people who are not from their group, and in this case it's black. And 6-year-olds have not even that level of executive control, so they will just say, I don't like kids who are different. I just want to do it with the one I like from my group or whatever it might be. So these are the data you'll see on self-report measures, with the greatest fairness being shown in adults, the next level of fairness being shown in 10-year-olds, and the least fairness being shown by 6-year-olds. Given these data, we have to predict now what the IAT will show, right? Because if you're 6 years old, you have vastly different experience with the world than if you're 10. And if you're 10, that's vastly different than adults. And certainly between 6-year-olds and adults, there's a huge difference. And that difference, I was certain, would translate in some way into exactly this kind of result. So I predicted one of two things. The IAT would look just like this, or the IAT would go in the opposite direction, because adults have spent a lot more time in the world learning all this stuff. 10-year-olds simply haven't done enough of that, and 6-year-olds should have almost no bias on the IAT. And the result was quite surprising to me. These are the adult data replicating many years of work. This is what 10-year-olds look like. This is what 6-year-olds look like. Okay? So whatever it is, this thing that we're tapping into this particular evaluative system, is pretty much in place fairly early in life, by which I mean based on very crude evidence. And we've now done studies on campuses in which we measure students coming in their first year, in their first week. 3 years later, towards things on campus, dorm A versus dorm B. And again, we're seeing exactly the same thing, that on day one, your attitude looks exactly on the IAT as it would look 4 years later. You come on campus, you become identified with group A versus B, and this thing gets set and is in place. And so I think this is worthy of much more investigation. And there are now other studies that we've done, actually I should go back, sorry, but that's only age 6, by the way. We can't go younger. A faculty member's child can be in our study at age 5 because they're precocious enough they can do that. But this test is not something that kids younger than age 6 can really handle. And so Eva Chen and Yarrow Dunham have devised a method that I can describe if you're interested, and it's a paper that appeared not too long ago in Psych Science, using this new method that allows us to test 2 years and older. I'm going to actually bring us to a close because I would like to chat by saying a few things towards the end. There's a fair amount of work on prediction, but there's more and more happening, and I'm very excited to see a bunch of behavioral economists taking the IAT and trying to predict things, at least in experimental markets. So I'll give you, this is a study that hasn't yet appeared in PNAS, but it will appear in the next, I think, week or 2. In this study, Zingales and his colleagues at University of Chicago create an experimental market. In the market, they tell people, you are the people hiring, you are the hired. So the people who are going to be hired have to perform what is called a math test, but it's actually nothing more than addition. Okay? So without any evidence, the hirers are asked to pick one of 2 people who appear in pairs in front of them, always one male and one female. Okay? So hirers consistently, statistically reliably, pick male over female when they know nothing because they think this is a math test. So they're using whatever they know to be true base rates about the difference between men and women on math performance, and they're picking more men than they're picking women, even though in actuality this test shows no gender difference. Okay? So far, economists would say people are behaving quite rationally, whatever you and I might say. Now, the second thing they do, and this is very important for lots of you in the room to hear, the second thing they do is they ask the people who've just finished the tests to look at all their little, they say, think about all the different numbers that you scored over the last few minutes, and now tell the person who's going to hire you your score. Women consistently underreport how well they've done. Men massively overreport. So women slightly underreport. Okay? The men make sense to me. You should want to get hired, right? You're trying to report. Now, maybe it's a bias in memory, I don't know. But in whatever, and this is on the front page of the Atlantic Monthly this month, so you should look at it, this gender gap in confidence across so many studies that even I was surprised. I thought there were 4 studies showing it. No, there are dozens of studies consistently showing some difference in this thing that we'll conquer. So now, when people are asked to hire, who should they hire? Of course, if I were the hirer, I would hire these men, okay? And they do. And then they give them in the 3rd stage the real data. And then they look to see if they will correct. Because now they can see that in a given pair, it's equally likely that the female or the male is good because they're actually performing equally. And what they show, sadly, is that having set this pattern in our minds, we don't change. We improve a little bit, but nowhere near what the evidence is telling us. The other thing that they did was, before they did this whole thing, they gave them an IAT looking at a general relationship between male-female and, in this case, I think, yeah, it's gender career, not even math. Gender career, very generic test. Okay? And they find that the IAT predicts both what your priors are, going in when you know nothing about the group, who do you pick? And when you look at the individual differences in who you pick, it turns out it correlates with the gender career test, suggesting that that IAT may be a nice representation of the associations kind of jiggling around in our heads as we make these choices about who might be the first person to pick in the absence of any information. But what to me is quite remarkable is that the IAT also predicts who does not change in the face of evidence. So when you get real objective evidence, to what extent do you put your priors aside and say, okay, I now know? It turns out that, again, that test will predict to some extent. So I think these kinds of studies are going to get us to other places. Many of you have read this particular study because it's about people like us, no matter who I talk to. If I talk to judges, they'll say, oh, professor, this might be true of everybody in the world, but not judges. or the police officers, but not true of police officers, and the MBA students will say, oh yeah, we know the lawyers are all screwed up, but not the business people. We care about objective evidence because we have to make money. So every group wants a study on its own group to believe these data. For some reason, it's very hard for us to accept that this is a genuine human problem. And so science faculty's bias, so this particular study from Yale, Joe Handelsman's group and several psychologists here. What's interesting about this study is a result that we've picked up for now 20 years, and that stunned me when I first saw it, and I thought it was a blip, but then it turns out it's true, and that is that in these studies, so the differences here are in selecting male candidate over female candidate given, equal resumes, but also starting male candidates with $4,000 more in starting salary, and saying, I will expend X number of hours in mentoring this person more when it's a male candidate. And because they're psychologists, they say, okay, so these behaviors are what they're performing. What's causing it? What's the underlying psychological dimension that's producing that outcome of $4,000 more? And it just comes down to a simple assessment of competence. In other words, you can see two sentences about two individuals that are identical. One will sound to you more competent than the other. And if we now know this, I think we owe it to our smart prefrontal cortexes to do something with it, right? So, and the fact that women are just as biased as men is the one that really puzzled me. So I made it turn around on PowerPoint because it could not quite fathom that, but it's true. And we should, again, I think, know that. They conclude in their abstract, they say these results suggest that interventions addressing faculty gender bias might advance the goal of increasing the participation of women in science. And I admonished them and said I would not have ended the abstract that way at all. This would have been my preferred ending to their abstract. These results suggest that interventions addressing faculty gender bias will advance the goal of improving the quality of science. Okay? I think we've got to make the case less and less about that particular poor individual who's being cost, because that's a moral judgment. As a society of moral actors, we can worry about that, about whether we want people to be treated equally or not, to what extent and how. But for us right now, I think it's becoming a calamity if we don't end up talking about the improving of the business world, the legal world, the academic world, whatever it might be. So in conclusion, I just want to say, if you are like me and you read flaky futurists. I read this one guy called Ray Kurzweil, who some of you you may know. But Ray Kurzweil is a futurist who's said some pretty improbable things, some of which have actually come true. And one of the things that he writes about is this idea that for those of you who are young in this room, that when your grandchildren are old, that they will live to see a time when there will be another species on the planet. That these will not be people who come from outer space yet, that these will be humans who will be born largely human, although they'll have so much implanted in them pre-birth, at birth, and then regularly post-birth, that that group will live, he predicts, for 900 years and will have IQs in the thousands and thousands. Okay? So look, he may be off by a few generations, but I sort of believe that history will look back at us and this next generation, your children, who will be, the parents of the people who will live to see such a thing happen. And I think if we're successful, we will look back and say, they taught them good. They made them understand who was self and other, who was an us and a them, how to make decisions that are actually objectively true and right, rather than what seems right to intuition, that they did all that, and therefore look how great this world now is. And if we don't, I think that will be another story that will be told. So I'm going to end with something that Richard Dawkins said a long time ago in a book that was deeply controversial when it came out, and now nobody thinks it is, in which he said something extremely important. He said, let us understand what our own selfish genes are up to, and I would say replace that with our own unconscious bias or blind spots or whatever you wish, because we may then at least have a chance, he says, to upset their designs, something that no other species has ever aspired to do. And that's optimistic. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't blown any heads off. Thank you. Fred, do I just take questions?
Yeah.
Yes.
Except
Yeah.
And does the IAT track it?
Yeah.
Changes that have happened?
Yeah, so we started to, because it's been around, and we put the sexuality test up fairly early, even though it was the one that brought us the most hate mail, that you're right. First of all, I should just say about sexuality that somebody in an audience last week said to me, "Why are you optimistic?" And I can't not point to sexuality and say that's why I'm optimistic. As just one simple example, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that, 70% of Americans said that they would be uncomfortable with a gay coworker, and now 90% say they'd be comfortable with a gay coworker, and many think they can marry, and all of that. This is not, we should think ourselves very lucky that we live in a time that we've seen such swift change, because seeing it happen in front of our eyes in a 10, 15-year period, I think is something that we cannot forget, because it tells us it's possible, right? If we wanted to. So when I was talking to people in Hollywood, and they're all, "Oh, what should we do?" I said, you did it for sexuality. Why don't you do it for race? And that was my question then, because I do think that two things changed us on sexuality. One, people started to come out to us, and we knew them before we discovered their sexuality, and one attitude was in place. Leon Festinger would have been so excited to have been alive, measuring how we resolved our cognitive dissonance, discovering that our child was gay or whatever, right? I mean, that would have been for him heaven. So that's one reason. But I think Hollywood really did it on a scale that they haven't on any other issue. They put amazingly smart, attractive, cool gay people in all kinds of television shows in a period of time that was kind of concentrated, and I think these people being in our living rooms did have some impact. So the question is, yes, we're beginning to see a small change. I cannot say for sure what it is, but unlike race, where when Obama became president, people said to us, "Oh, go look at the race test." Zero change, as we would have expected. We know that that's not, this is, when people say we now live in post-racial America, our data would say we don't, because the race IAT has stayed consistent since that first election. But the gay one does seem to be changing. So I can't say because it's tiny right now, but I think it's going in that direction. Yeah. And one other thing on the gays test, it's the only one where we see a very interesting reversal. On most of these dimensions, people will report a much more neutral attitude than they will show on the IAT, right? On the sexuality test, extreme conservatives show the reverse. They report disliking gay people a lot more than they show on the IAT, suggesting that even in their minds, the culture changing is shifting their implicit dislike of people who are gay, but they know that given their values, they must always say that they hate them. Yeah. Yeah.
Given what you just said, what kinds of interventions do you think will cause change, other than the Hollywood thing? I mean, we can't control the Hollywood thing, but what other kinds of things are out there?
Well, we can. Yeah. Hispanics control Hollywood by going to movies when they appear. It turns out that all this interest in Hispanics as a group for Hollywood, which is a new thing, came about because they discovered that when a new movie opens, any movie, that 30% of the audience is Hispanic. And so I think this is so you can make people make movies about you by encouraging them with your pocketbook. But in any case, how do you do internet? Okay, so I'll say something fairly simplistic. When we look at these changes, we know that they're coming in two forms. Individual minds change, but for me that's pretty slow. You can see on race, it's nowhere like it should be. So there I do believe that institutional change is going to be an important player. I don't think that the will of this country is in the right place for that to happen. And I say that because I'm bicultural and I grew up till I was 24 and lived in one country, recently made independent before I was born. 1947 is the year India became independent. I was born in the late 50s. And that country had such a huge problem of inequality to deal with that crazy things were done. Equality was created by just literally not allowing people who had access in the past to have access. Like they couldn't get into college anymore. It would be like saying if you went to Groton High School, you simply cannot get in anymore to Harvard. We don't do things like that here. So I don't know that that is even nearly at all possible, but I'm beginning to feel that there is enough of a discussion around inequality where I do see traction. For whatever reason, Americans are more moved by economic inequality than they're moved by the race issue. And so I'm thinking that this may be a moment when much will happen because many eyes are on the question of inequality. I'm just on a board that's seeing the shift, not just because of what Obama is saying, but because everybody is talking about it. And I assume that something like that will happen. And my friend Lani Guinier in the law school will also say that when she thinks about whether it's voting rights or whether it is about schools or whatever, that the focus should be on inequality. And we can have, it's a very big and very complex discussion. Yes, yeah. I'll come to you next. Yeah.
I'm a psychiatrist
Yeah.
And teach in medical schools. One of the concerns I've had is how to take your work and apply them to us as clinicians, because in the literature you talk about that implicit associations are with physicians are very biased against African Americans, and so that I know the video and others are trying to come up with programs, but are you aware of any programs where there's clear focus not only say for medical schools but social work and psychology and service providers as well?
So medical schools, yes. Okay. So medical schools in general, and I'm pretty sure it's not just our work that did this, but medical schools now are requiring, the MCAT has changed. A third of the items are going to be from the social sciences. And the example that they gave was our experiment in why they think that people ought to know this in medical school just as much as org chem. So I think that slight shift is happening, but I think medical schools in general are pretty ahead in terms of making this a part of the discussion of all medically trained people in whatever way they can. It's just very hard. I think that clinicians have a particular issue that teachers and social workers do. We think that we are doing God's work, right? We think we don't do things for money. We want to help people. We're going to be doing things that will involve sacrificing. I won't work on Wall Street. I'll work in a university so I can, teach, or whatever it might be. And those people are the hardest to change on this because they believe that they were put here directly by God on earth to do this great work. And so when I talk to social workers, I have the hardest time persuading them that it's a bias when they say somebody is 14 years old and cannot be adopted and must remain in foster care. And I say, why? Or 10 times to them, why? Why not? They just can't entertain the possibility that they are morally in any way lacking. And those are the hardest people. So I will tell you, it's much easier to persuade a conservative that this might be going on in their heads. They'll tell you, yeah, I know. Right? So there's a difference. Yes, you, and then I'll come to you in a second.
What exactly do you think the IIT is measuring? It's measuring some sort of association between, say, African Americans good and whites bad. But it's actually a little surprising to me in some ways that you would find that white people are more quickly to associate, say, whites with good, but for African Americans, that they're right around zero. 50% of the time, they are more quicker to associate, good words that are good with African Americans versus the opposite.
Yeah,
So
I would
what
point you
exactly is it
to.
measuring?
I would point you to. So when in one of the early slides, remember I said that there is the similarity to self as one variable we're interested in, and that the other is, and I'll just call that social power. If we begin to think about these two as pretty much determining everything in our perceptions of others, you will have a very good model that will predict the data you just mentioned. It does matter where you sit. So Black Americans do show more pro-Black bias than white Americans do, and white Americans certainly show more pro-in-group bias. So we know something about where you sit matters. Your group is better. Okay? But it's not equal and symmetric and opposite. And that isn't because the world signals, and what this IAT is picking up is not just where you sit, but how valued is your group in the larger culture. And what is stunning to me and I didn't talk about those data in the Dunham and Chen paper, is that because we can go as low as age 2 or 3, we can see that white 3-year-olds look like adult 3-year-olds. Okay? Sorry, white 3-year-olds look like white adults. Okay? But black 3-year-olds don't look like white 3-year-olds. They don't look like other kids. They look like black adults. Telling us that by age 3, both of these are playing a role. You like your own group because it's like you. You don't like your own group because you know other people don't. And this is happening even for something like a preference for a dorm. Measure kids here, I bet you'll see this. On day 1, measure them for the dorm they're being assigned to versus some other dorm, and they will look exactly the same as kids 4 years later in showing which is the cooler one. So it's not like they're all preferring their own. They know that's the cooler dorm. Mine is the one that sucks, and I've been assigned to it randomly, so I'll be here, but that doesn't mean I'm going to, on the IET, on the explicit measure you will. They'll say, I like my own. But not. So I think this combination of you fitting into a group, creating similarity, and so on is one mechanism for love of whatever, people, groups, etc. And the other is a very big lid that's being placed by what the culture tells us is good or bad. There was one, yes, you and then you in the back.
Since
Yeah.
you brought up admission at Harvard,
Yeah.
you probably saw today's op-ed in the New York Times giving those same statistics you had about the 20%.
Oh.
that
Oh, really?
60, yeah, but talking about legacy admissions.
Yep.
And the fact that
Yep.
the children of alumni still
Yep.
have a much easier time. of
Sure
getting
they
that.
do, yeah.
That-
And that's what will be unconscionable in 50 years,
and
yeah.
I was going to probe the limits of your optimism.
Yeah.
You've been at Harvard a while, you were at Yale a while, you think that's going to change?
Yeah, very much so. I think already it has. Because when I first went to Yale, I remember going to see the dean to talk about our affirmative action program. And he thought I was going to talk about affirmative action as he imagined it. And I had in mind the legacy program, which is an affirmative action program.
Exactly.
So I remember that in 1987, that was a hard idea to get across. Yes, I'm here to talk about affirmative action. And he would say, yes, it's a problem. What should we do? And I said, I think it's a real problem. What do you think we should do? And by end of 5 minutes, we realized that we were talking about 2 entirely different groups. I think that is changing myself. And look, that's being done very explicitly. So I will say, I actually asked for the data of the children of legacy, the legacies. And on all the objective measures, they're no different from the top of the class. That I can tell you. However, there are hundreds for each one of them. There are hundreds like them who are not getting in. And they do have it. This is the helping of your own. And this, I'm told to take out of my talk when I talk to donors. Don't talk about the not helping your own, Mahzarin. Leave that part out when you talk to the donors. No, so I think that it's going to happen. Look, these are other things. I mean, nobody ever thought that if you didn't have, a lot of money that you could go to Harvard. I mean, wealth was the single dimension that they used. They didn't use anything like grades for the longest time. It didn't matter what your grades were. You were a gentleman. You came from Groton, and your grades were irrelevant. Because the whole class was being admitted. So I'm here to say if that can change, I think that this will. And I think foreign students are putting enormous pressure because they are better than the legacies. So it's becoming very hard to argue for a lesser quality legacy over a higher quality applicant. And that's when I think it will go. So we used to admit about 12, 13% of the applicant pool. And I've noticed in the last 2 years it's dropped to 5 because just the numbers of qualified applicants has gone up.
Have you published the data on the national differences in various IIT measures? So you have data from.
Oh yeah, so I didn't show them to you. Are you interested in just roughly what we see? I mean, yeah. So look, everywhere in the world there is an association of white with good, even in Africa. Not equal. Age is a very interesting cultural difference. So in every country we've ever tested, elderly is bad, young is good, but the variation is pretty substantial, with Germany anchoring the strongest bias and India anchoring the least bias, and not because of what you might think, East and West. Turns out East-West is much less of an explanation. In fact, it's not an explanation for the data. Instead, it's something truly interesting, which we'll get back to your question about what is the IAT measuring. Anti-elderly bias is strongest in those countries where the proportion of elderly is higher compared to young. So I'll say that again, right? anti-elderly bias is higher in those countries where there are more elderly people compared to young people. So in India, the number of young people is just huge compared to the elderly. And in Germany, it is almost the reverse. And that predicts the level of anti-elderly bias across culture very, very well. And that's that second piece. If you see elderly people in your country and they make you feel a threat about the resources they'll take or whatever, or you see more of them and so you associate, you generate those associations many more times a day or whatever it might be, that is a contributor. Lots of other interesting data. One quick one on gender and math is that we did a study that's in PNAS that took the web data just by country and came up with a single gender stereotype score on the math arts test, male-female math arts test for each country. So we know what it is for Romania or Bulgaria or whatever it might be. And then we use that score to go in and predict how well kids are doing on some certain national math test at, let's say, 8th grade level or something like that. And what we find is that the gender stereotype found for the country as a whole predicts the gender difference in math ability and so on across the globe. So, yeah.
We hope you'll join us for the reception upstairs. We have a small token of appreciation.
Thank
Please
you.
join me in thanking Professor Banaji.
Thank you. Thanks.